study out today that says women become unhappy as they get older. Well, the flip side, men get happier as life goes on.
First of all, this study was conducted by mostly men. And when men conduct anything, they talk about their finances because men judge themselves by the size of their wallet, toys, dare I say. So you put all your toys together in a parking lot and it makes you happy. If they were to ask other questions in this study about spirituality, about the other aspects of our lives, that women would have taken over. I mean, first of all, a woman hits her sexual prime at 35. There's a reason that women live longer, Mark. Let me tell you. It is because we are stronger and we are happier at the end of the day than most men. And that is factual and you know it.
When men are married to women who scream like you, they just want to die sooner.
Oh, that was good.
What I love about these is that you, Anthony and Rob, are catching up on like what we watched a decade ago, and you're like, these are amazing. I'm like, they are amazing.
Here's the thing. I gave up. So I didn't actually give up Twitter for Lent. What I did was
we know at this point.
I'm only going to post edifying stuff, right? So yesterday I posted, and we're going to get into one of the tweets I posted because of one of the responses to it. And then today I posted something, edifying. And then I have to kind of go through Twitter to find show stuff. Like it's where I get content for the show. So there's no way around it. I kind of have to do it. So I saw that video and I'm like, okay, this works for an opener. And I throw it up. So that's where I got it, Nick. I don't know what to tell you.
But I'm glad that we're all here today because today we're going to be talking about the heresy that is Scotism and why St. Thomas Aquinas.
So Gideon Lazar is here. Gideon Lazar is here. We've been trying to get Gideon on for a very long time now. We have like 10,000 new subs in the past 3 months, and Rob and I did like a series of episodes. Nick too. Nick was with us. We did a series of episodes on evolution, and we kind of like went through it over the course of a few months, and then we haven't spoken about it in like a year and a half. But we have a lot of new subscribers, and I think I think it'll be exciting to talk about again because we haven't touched on this topic in a long time. Gideon, this is kind of like his specialty. Gideon, you're participating in a conference coming up, right?
Yeah. So for my work, I work for something called the St. Basil Institute for the Study of the Theology of Creation. And so essentially the idea behind this symposium behind this whole institute is that we felt a lot of the discussions around the theology of creation really tend nowadays to focus on sort of faith science debates. So you get on one side, people are, how do we reconcile Catholicism and evolution? And on the other side, you get, all right, how do we use modern science to actually refute evolution? But it really focuses on the scientific aspect. And what we felt is that there wasn't actually enough discussion on what does the Catholic Church actually teach on the theology of creation? And this is a huge issue. Like, we've interviewed seminarians and stuff and found that in a lot of seminaries today, they're not even teaching seminarians about the theology of creation. We have found, there's a mention at one point from Ratzinger in one of his books about how this isn't being taught in seminaries. And it seems like it's gotten a bit better. Like, people are realizing this is a big discussion. Yeah. We're noticing other institutes are doing conferences as well. But we felt like we wanted to help advance that discourse. And so we've been meeting in private for the last few years. And we thought this year, why don't we do something a bit more public, invite in some other people to watch our discussions. And this is not just, like, we're not as an institute against evolution per se. Like, we have theistic evolutionist speakers. We have speakers who are very critical of theistic evolution. But what we try to do is say, all right, let's not focus on those scientific debates. Let's focus on the theological matters at hand. So the link in the description, you'll find a link to the conference. We have the schedule up, as well as a link to register. Tickets are selling, so please make sure to go ahead and register if you'd like to attend. It's June 6th through 8th in Steubenville at the St. Paul Center. Like, we have an amazing lineup of speakers here. We got Scott Hahn, John Bergsma, Jared Goff, who used to be big on YouTube a few years ago, Father Thomas Crean, We also have this panel discussion with Father Thomas Crean and 2 other speakers, Timothy Kearns and Brother Matthew Warnes, on how does human sin affect the natural world. So we'll have Father Thomas Crean defending that Adam's sin not only caused human death, but also caused animal death. Dr. Timothy Kearns will be arguing actually it's the fall of Satan that caused animal death. And Brother Matthew Warnes arguing that no, actually it's the original intention of God that animals die and that animals were never included in this gift. This is an open question in Catholic theology. This will be a great discussion. And then we have a whole bunch of other speakers as well. We have a retreat with Mass in the Dominican Rite. So it's going to be an awesome conference. Please come if you can. It'll be a great time.
June 6th to the 8th, right?
Yeah.
With that lineup, it's going to sell out. So I would tell you guys, if you have any interest in it, get your tickets, because it's at the St. Paul Center. It's in Steubenville, and you got guys like Han there. It's going to sell out. So if you guys can and you're considering it, definitely put it on your calendar and get those tickets as quick as you can. So we're going to get into that topic a little bit later. I wanted to kind of discuss the some of the insane Protestant takes that I've seen from Lent before we did. And we also have an article written by a Protestant about how Catholic apologetics are exploding online, and how, like, it used to be Protestants who would use Catholics as like prime, like fertile ground to go and pull converts towards Protestantism. And it's kind of flipped the other way now, where Catholics are tempting Protestants towards tradition, because we kind of have like a more, whatever. We'll get into the article and we'll get into that. Before we do, Rob, we have an ad to read or anything, or?
Yeah, let's play our ad for our sponsor, Requisite Sellers. And while that plays, why don't you work on your mic? It's making a terrible crackling noise.
All right, let me.
Okay, but I'm going to play the ad here. This video is brought to you by Requisite Sellers, the winery with the mission. These folks are unapologetically Catholic and pro-life, so they're not just fermenting grapes, they're fermenting conviction. A small, family-run fruit farm and winery in Washington State. They're pouring out big, full-bodied, Bordeaux-style red wines that will make your taste buds say amen. Plus, they've got farm-fresh fruit, so pre-order now, and they'll ship it when it's ripe. Swing by their site, requisitesellers.com. Use code BASED25, that's BASED25, for 10% off. And sip some grace while supporting Avoiding Babylon. Cheers to that. Hold on, wait a minute. Okay, talk now.
Is it still going? Is it still happening?
That sounds good.
What is it? Is
I
it
can hear you now.
crackling? All right, guys.
Like crackling like you had wire interference.
All right, guys, let me know if it got any better. I don't know. Okay, so I want to start off with Rob. I sent you the tweet to the show notes with me saying, "Oh no, that's the wrong one." Wait, the one. Shoot, which one was it?
I don't know.
Sorry, guys. Oh, embrace these small penances. So I sent you a tweet. It says, embrace these small penances we offer. All right. So embrace these small penances we offer to God. This is our opportunity to unite our sufferings to the cross of Christ, to participate even a little to the salvation of souls. And I posted a quote from St. Francis de Sales, said, so devotion is the real spiritual sweetness which takes away all bitterness from mortifications and prevents consolations from disagreeing with the soul. It cures the poor of sadness and the rich of presumption. It keeps the oppressed from feeling desolate and the prosperous from insolence. It averts sadness from the lonely and dissipation from social life. It is as warmth in winter and refreshing dew in summer. It knows how to abound and how to suffer want, how to profit alike by honor and contempt. It accepts gladness and sadness with an even mind, and fills men's hearts with wondrous sweetness. So underneath it, you'll see the response from AJ.
Apparently no one can see what I'm sharing. Which is,
what do you mean?
You guys can see what I have on screen, right?
I see it,
Yeah.
That's very strange. It's not appearing on the YouTube.
Are you sure it's not? Well, I guess it's interesting.
Well, let's try this again.
Man, we're having all sorts of tech issues tonight, huh?
Weird, because we can all see it here, but it's not actually streaming out.
Did they see the opening
Yeah,
video?
let us know, y'all.
Yeah, they saw the ad. They saw all that. They just can't see what I'm sharing.
Still nothing. Dang.
Still nothing.
Yeah, I just checked the YouTube stream. It's not going.
That is
all right.
so
Well,
weird.
either way, our crazy resident AJ said, and yet you tell me you don't believe in salvation by works.
See if they can see this.
Can you guys see that?
No,
I guess not. So to say something like embrace these small penances we offer to God with joy, this is our opportunity to unite our sufferings to the cross of Christ, to participate even a little in the salvation of souls. And somebody else wrote, if you think you can participate in your own salvation, then sorry. There is this strange thing that happens in Protestantism where they say good works are okay. So you're saved by faith alone, and good works are done in gratitude because of the fact that you were saved. Like that's how they see it, right? So there's actually a canon from the Council of Trent that says that that's anathema. If you claim that, that's anathema. Because in a way, what they're saying is they are responsible for their good works. Where like for a Catholic, look, so not being on social media as much, I'm not saying I'm off totally, but not being on it as much. I've spent a lot of the last 2 days reading, and I've read more in the last 2 days than I have in like the last year. And so much of what I'm reading is all about how during this time of penance, the practice of fasting, prayer, and almsgiving and good works throughout Lent, like the good works will grow God's love in your heart. Like you actually are, it's like turning a flame into a fire. By doing good works, you actually enkindle God's love within you. They have absolutely no concept of this whatsoever. And they don't actually see it as good works are the response to grace. It's more like they see good works in opposition to grace.
Mm-hmm. I want to highlight here M. Proximus's comment, because I think this biblical verse like really blows up the whole Protestant position here. Like, could you imagine if this quote wasn't in the New Testament and was like in Thomas Aquinas or something, how Protestants would react to it?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. If this was written by a church father and not St. Paul.
I guarantee if you just put this out as a tweet, you would get Protestants saying that that's crazy.
Yeah. And have you ever guys seen that like meme where there was some Protestant debating with some Eastern Orthodox, and the Protestant guy like stuck up some quote from the New Testament and then put like Dash Martin Luther afterwards, and then the Orthodox guy went on to explain how it's heretical? Like, I feel like you could do this here, but with like a church father against some Protestant.
Oh man, it really is strange how they see Lent. Like, there's another guy who said, if you are going to give something up for Lent, I suggest that you give up pagan practices, like Lent, for example. How they can see the practice of fasting for 40 days to imitate our Lord, right? And even before that, they understand tithing, right? So the original practice was actually giving up 36 days as a tithe of your days of the year. So that was how Lent kind of originated. It was like, oh, well, we have to tithe a tenth of our days. So it was 36 days. Then the church later adds Ash Wednesday to Good Friday to make it more symbolic with the 40 days of Christ and Moses and Elijah fasting for their time. But the idea that they think imitating Christ could actually be a deficit to your salvation is like confounding to me. I don't get it.
Well, it's interesting because it's like selective following of Christ. So it's like they will, of course, emphasize the reality of like loving your neighbor and doing good to the poor, things along that sort. But when it comes to the reason that they're going to reject Lent is because Lent for us is penance, right? Doing penance, punishing past sins, doing reparation for past sins, elevating the intellect. Whereas for them, they don't have a concept of penance because, again, in their mind, with propitiatory justification by faith alone, it's just going to be God declares you righteous, so there is no need to do penance. Although it is weird, you brought this up, Anthony, about like the swing of Protestants becoming Catholic. I'm even starting to see local evangelical churches around here, including my old one from when I grew up, we're starting to do more Catholic-y practices. As an example, this is the first year that they're celebrating Lent. Now, it's insane. This is a non-denom, evangelical, normie place, but they're celebrating Lent. Now, they're not doing penances. They're not fasting. They're not doing almsgiving, but they're just talking about like resurrection stories about how Christ has impacted your life. Of course, that's fine, but it's interesting because you're just starting to see almost like a wayward child. You have to imitate the parent in one form or fashion. So it's like all evangelicals deep down want to be Catholic in some form.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you think that's because that might link into the article we're going to read, where I think more than our Catholic hierarchy recognizes it, that I do think a lot of Protestant pastors are starting to recognize the draw of tradition, right? Like going back to some ancient practices from the early church, something like Lent. And I think they see the online apologists presenting these traditions and Protestants are jumping at them, where I think our own hierarchy is trying to like get rid of some of these traditions, not recognizing the state the world is in right now, and that especially young men want to be challenged and they kind of want to go find something the world doesn't offer them.
Yeah, orthodoxy is huge for that reason. You see, and I think it's similar to, for instance, in 2020 when everything got shut down, how a lot of Catholics saw the traditional Latin Mass for the first time online and they got drawn to it. A lot of evangelicals are looking around and they're like, okay, I kind of get tired of Big Eva mega rock concert church. I'm looking around for something more filling. And then they look and they see the Orthodox Church or they see a traditional Mass and they're drawn to that. And honestly, for an evangelical, when you just crack the fathers open, most evangelicals have never been exposed to the church fathers. Yeah. And when they do, it comes as a hard shock. As my own example, I didn't eat for 3 days whenever I realized the Catholic Church was true, because I recognized just how messed up and wrong I was. But that thing is happening over and over and over again to all of these people, all the young men. When you go to a Protestant evangelical service, if you see this guy up there with his coffee and skinny jeans talking about how, how's your heart, brothers? How is your heart? As opposed to, dude, my life is like overcome with sin. Society hates me. I need to cling to somewhere, right? And that's why they're going to tradition.
So Gideon, we're going to talk. Okay, so when we go on locals tonight, we're going to actually talk about the phenomena of Torah observing Christians and Messianic Jews. We're going to talk to Gideon about that a little bit just to get his take. So Gideon, you're actually a Jewish convert and you end up going to the Byzantine Rite. Did you ever do the Novus Ordo thing, or did you go right to the Byzantine Rite?
So I'll say technically I'm Byzantine Rite, but like with 2 little kids in the Byzantine Rite and Latin Mass, both like an hour away. Honestly, most Sundays I go to the local Novus Ordo nowadays. Oh, okay. But it's interesting for like coming from this Jewish background, right? They're giving people an example of like just how liberal theologically the synagogue I grew up in is. I remember hearing a sermon once about how the Exodus never happened. I told when I was going to become a Christian, I went and I met with my rabbi and I told him about this. And his answer was that really no religion is true. So you might as well just remain Jewish. And what else? As another example, I'm pretty sure that they would have been okay, for example, with like marrying 2 men so long as they were both Jewish. So like, wow. This is the sort of like liberalism that I grew up in terms of religion. But we did everything liturgically, very traditionally. And like when I had my bar mitzvah, I had to learn all the proper Hebrew chant and everything. Like I spent a year learning all the proper notation and making sure I had to get a tutor and everything to make sure I had it. We had to look up like obscure chant notation and stuff at some point. So we were very liturgically traditional. So coming into Christianity, to me, part of religion was liturgy from the beginning, and like written set prayers. Part of it was sacred language. Like I did not pray in English at all growing up. I only prayed in Hebrew. And so to me, this is just the world of like seeing especially low church Protestantism just looks so weird. Like to me, the Novus Ordo is extremely low church, Yeah. And then you look at Protestants, like in college, I went to a Catholic college and I had a very good friend there who was non-denominational. And he went to the Novus Ordo when he was at churches. He was lowercase. There's the uppercase non-denominational where it's really a denomination. And you got the lowercase ones of, we're all just Christians. And he was more like that. So he would go to Mass with Catholics on Sunday at the church. And he would go to like the most like college campus type, like Novus Ordo, like the 10 p.m. where they have like flutes and guitars out and stuff. And he would talk about like, oh, this is like kind of too ritualistic for me.
So Gideon, I'm curious real quick. Oh, God. What sect of Judaism? Because like that's an interesting mix. So is this like a conservative version or something? Like conservative Judaism?
So a lot of people, they don't understand when they hear the word conservative, they think like it's actually conservative. What it really means more is liturgically conservative. Like it's compared to the Episcopalians. Like you go into an Episcopal church and you'd almost think you're attending like a very beautiful like Catholic church until you hear the sermon and it's about gay marriage or something like that, you know? Versus like I go to my cousin's Reformed synagogue and they would have like projectors up, they would use some guitars, like it was not as liturgically traditional.
But they'd be like, gays are not going to heaven.
No.
Something like that.
So I'll tell you the wildest sermon I ever heard is, so they only do the readings in Hebrew. They don't do the readings in English, but the books have the readings in English if you want to read along. So I'm at my cousin's bar mitzvah and I'm reading along in the English. And the reading is something from like Deuteronomy, like forbidding cross-dressing. But it also says at one point in there, justice, justice, you shall pursue. And the rabbi proceeds to give a sermon on how we need to fight for like gay rights and stuff like that, because the Torah talks about justice. Like, I don't know how these liberal rabbis get around this, right? Because you have, like, if you like are Christian, right? And you see like some gospel readings, you can take some gospel readings and try to twist them into some sort of liberal message and stuff, right? In Judaism, you have liturgical readings about stoning people to death. Yeah. Like, how do you turn this into like some liberal stuff?
So the reason I was asking is because you going from Judaism into Catholicism, like how alien is this Protestant understanding of just kind of like it's gotta seem more alien to you. Like you were never tempted by Protestantism, right?
No, I wasn't. No, there's some Protestant like biblical scholars and stuff I very much liked reading. I've really appreciated their work, but I've never really been interested in being Protestant because it lacks any aspect of religion. Like St. Thomas Aquinas has this whole discussion on the virtue of religion. And we tend to think about religion nowadays as something strictly supernatural. But St. Thomas actually sees it as something natural, that we know through human reason that God exists. And we all have this longing in our human heart to honor God. And we have a desire to honor God through ritual. And so things like sacrifice and priesthood and other things, St. Thomas sees this as actually something natural, that there's never been a society in human history that doesn't have things like sacrifice and priesthood and ritual and so on. And so that's just how we honor God. And so you have to have something there. If you take it away, something else is going to replace it.
Yeah, somebody pointed out the other day on Twitter that a lot of these what was it? The Puritans that came over to America, they come here and they get rid of all the liturgical trappings of Catholicism in their mind, and they become Freemasons. And they start doing these dark, ritualistic things because the human heart really is designed for liturgy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now Rob, so the other one I saw was, for the next 40 days, I'm giving up nothing. Jesus paid it all, and I will find rest in all that he gave up for me. This lack of, like, I don't understand what they think Jesus means when he says, build treasure in heaven. Like, how do you make sense of when Christ actually tells us, like, when you do something, don't, if you give with your right hand, don't let your left hand see what you're doing. Or don't, when you pray, don't do as the Pharisees do, because you will receive your reward from men. Like if you're parading your holiness around, you're receiving your reward on earth, but do it in secret in a dark room, and only your Father in heaven sees it, and then you will build treasure in heaven. I don't understand what they do with verses like that. It's kind of like there's this compartment that they just ignore completely.
Yeah. It's something that I think that, at least from my days, they would view those verses as, these are going to be rewards given to you in heaven. They don't determine whether or not you will be saved, but how much rewards you will get in heaven. The issue, though, that when you come across at this is that when you look at the writings, in particular of St. Paul, right, that we just referenced earlier, he is warning the churches over and over and over again. 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, Ephesians 5, 1 through 5, Galatians 5, 19 through 21, that if you do wicked actions, adultery, fornication, sodomy, effeminacy, lying, murder, cheating, etc., you will not inherit the kingdom of God. And these are written to Christians, like the books are addressed to the churches at Galatia, to the churches at Ephesians, etc. And so when you look at what the Protestant mindset is, it's one of, we've come from a founder that was hyper scrupulous. Luther was hyper scrupulous. He didn't like the fact that he was not experientially righteous in this exact moment. And so he created his system. And so from there, we have this whole mentality of Christ paid it all, which is true in the sense that Christ earned an infinite amount of merits by his death and grace, but he applies that to us when we say yes. So the only way I personally, this is my hot take for the night, I guess, before we get into locals and start talking about really spicy stuff. But for the normie crowd, my hot take is this: the only consistent Protestant is a Calvinist. Because ultimately, for Luther's system to work, you have to deny free will's existence. That's the only way for it to work. If you believe in free will, then man has to choose God in some form or fashion, or cooperate with God in some form or fashion. If man doesn't have free will, then yes, it is totally on God, and he has to declare us righteous. We can't do anything because we don't have a will.
So, okay. I get, all right. From here, I think we should go into the two drastic opposing things that I saw online this week. One was on Crisis Magazine. Eric Sammons posted an article how for every 100 Catholics that get baptized and brought into the church, 800 are leaving. So that was one side, and it was kind of like, oh my goodness, this is devastating. We have to get a handle on this. But then the other side was this Protestant article that Rob sent today, and it says Roman Catholic apologetics is surging online, intended audience Protestants. So, Rob, you want to pull that article up?
Yeah, let's see if this one actually works.
Yeah, let's see if it works. Someone in the chat was saying that Christian Wagner had issues too. So there might be a StreamYard issue, like overall system issue. Let us know if you guys can see that.
Nope, it's not broadcasting.
It's not broadcasting. Okay, I'll just read it then.
It has to be a StreamYard thing. Like, did they do an update or something?
StreamYard just introduced something called scenes, where you can edit, you can have different scenes ready for different sort of things. And no, it's on now. It just took a while. Okay, they see it.
Okay, they see it. Okay, so in recent years, several notable Protestant converts to Roman Catholicism have made waves online. Influencers like Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity, Candace Owens, Joshua Charles, Josh gets a shout out in this.
Oh, I want to see you try to pronounce this.
Eva Vlardinger broke.
That's better than I thought you were going to do.
Is that I don't know. So she crossed the Tiber from various expressions of Protestantism. Prominent evangelical pastors like Ulf Ekman, Keith Nestor, another shout out to our friend, and Brooke Thelander have made headlines when they converted to Roman Catholicism. Similar stories are littered across social media, YouTube, and websites like the Coming Home Network. Prior decades witnessed numerous prominent Protestant to Catholic conversions, including Francis Beckwith, Christian Smith, and Thomas Howard. I don't know any of them. What drives these Christian thinkers to make this jump? Several theories could be explored, but one factor might concern the surprising savvy of online Catholic apologetics, particularly on platforms like YouTube. When someone has questions surrounding various views on Christian traditions, doctrines, or sacraments, example given the Eucharist, a YouTube search will turn up a litany of Roman Catholic videos, while Protestant perspectives are rarely sufficient and accurately presented. I suspect there are at least two reasons. I'm going to keep reading, Rob, so don't take it down. I can't believe Catholic Answers doesn't get any kind of shout out in here. This is so funny. Like, there's not even a mention of Catholic Answers, Trent Horn, Jimmy Aiken, none of those guys. So first, Catholic apologists are much more focused on growing Roman Catholicism as an institution, i.e. the one true church, than on merely winning souls for Christ. That's nonsense.
Gee, I wonder why.
This makes sense given Catholicism's traditional view that to be outside the church is to be outside Christ. That is correct. The call home is a call to the institution of the Catholic Church, not merely a call to find redemption in Christ. Second, Protestant apologetics has leaned heavily into addressing atheism, postmodernism, and modern secular culture's loss of morality, with focusing enough on learning and practicing our Protestant distinctives. But it is precisely this focus on Protestant distinctives that would naturally clarify the differences between Protestant tradition and Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Take it down. We'll get back into it. I want to just touch on something here real quick, because this goes kind of to the Michael Knowles, Charlie Kirk conversation too, right? The fact that modern evangelicalism is so disjointed, and a majority of what you see as apologetics is different streams of Christian thought, none of it coherent. You get people on Twitter like Sola Chad and AJ and Indiana Brunner. Now, all of these guys all claim to read the Bible and believe it, and they have sola scriptura. But if you bring up like anything to do with like end times or anything like that, like they'll start arguing with each other and none of them agree on anything.
I mean, half the people that would read this would probably take issue with being called Protestant even. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
exactly. A lot of them don't like the fact that they're being called Protestant. But I do think there's this new way of having this conversation where they're hearing things they've never heard before, right? Like there was always just that one path of Catholic answers that people would go to, and they would give these copy paste answers from Catholic answers, which were always very good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not, if you're talking about discussing something with a Protestant, like the Catholic Answers platform has plenty of good resources, but I do think all of these new guys coming in are doing it from a different angle. Like Gideon, you said your first time watching our show was because you were looking something up with Joshua Charles.
Yeah.
And Josh and I, like both of us, kind of feel the best way to evangelize now is not even through like quote text, what do you call it, proof texting through scripture and things like that, but more to go back through Christian history and show the spread of Christianity through the pagan world, or using typology or something like that, are better arguments towards Protestants in this modern day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big shifts in Catholic YouTube is that we used to be the Catholic Answers, which was very much geared towards fundamentalist evangelicals, because those were really big in sort of the mid to late 20th century in America, right? But like people always talk about, like, for example, dispensationalism on Twitter. Like I've seen like 2 dispensationalists like ever on Twitter. Like they're just not around among Gen Z Protestants even anymore. Like the landscape has just shifted so much in the online Christian world that like now we're responding, right, to more intelligent critiques of Catholicism. For example, from the Orthodox, from people like Jay Dyer, from the Protestant side, people like Gavin Ortland, who are putting forward more substantive critiques of our tradition. And I think at first when that stuff began happening, it really scared the Catholic world, right? Because like Jay Dyer could seem to like steamroll Catholic Answers.
Yeah.
But now we've had a new generation of young people coming on who are returning to our tradition. And they thought they sort of had us, and now we're back to winning, I think, again online, Like we just have such a richer intellectual tradition. And then there's also a lot of people online who are just interested in like learning about perhaps what other religions have to think and just get impressed with our theological tradition. Like I recently got in touch with a young rabbi, he's about our age, about 25 or so, who reached out to me online. We spoke over the phone for like 4 hours or so, and he loves YouTube channels like mine or Christian Wagner's or other people, because coming from a very traditional Jewish education, he can then see what is a coherent theological system and what is not. And so he can really respect scholasticism, even though he disagrees, because he can see its internal consistency and how it makes sense and so on, versus the Catholic Answers approach is not impressive unless your intellectual background is just, say, like fundamentalist evangelicalism, because then you have so little intellectual background in your tradition that anything looks really impressive,
I was watching Ruslan yesterday. And his co-host said they were because they were talking about the Sam Shamoon thing, which we got to get Sam Shamoon back on to discuss his whole thing with George Janko. Yes. I texted him, and I did talk to him behind the scenes a little bit, but so Ruslan was discussing it, and he was like talking about Catholicism a little bit, and his co-host goes, "I got to tell you, the Catholics kind of got me on 2 issues: the saints and artificial birth control." And he goes, and Ruslan goes, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, like the logic is so consistent when it comes to artificial birth control. He goes, I don't think I'm going to follow it. I'm still going to use it, but the logic is really sound and tight.
That's why you need the strict
move.
rules. This is why you need like the strict rules on these things, all right? Because when our concupiscence is so pushing us against doing something that for most people, the only way they'll do it is if they're told you have to, right? So something like birth control, anything short of it is absolutely forbidden is not going to convince 95% of people.
Listen, the thing that actually convinced me the Catholic Church was the one true church was the birth control issue. It was like every other denomination of Christianity caved on this issue except Catholicism. And it's like, it is the, and if you go through the teaching and you understand why Catholics teach that, it's like the most sound logic. And it's the only way you can use it. Like Protestants, the only defense they have to say that same-sex anything is wrong is by quoting something from the Old Testament. Like it's not even mentioned in the New Testament, where Catholics use the natural law and they say that there's a purpose behind your sex organs. And it's like, you know, you have a purpose to these. So by using the natural law, you could come to the conclusion that artificial birth control is wrong. Any kind of sex outside of wedlock is wrong. So you have a very consistent worldview where it's not just plucking a scripture verse. And then, because if you just pull that Old Testament verse out where it says, you know, man shall not lie with a man, you could also go and say, okay, but why can't you eat shellfish anymore? Or why can't you? And that'll be something will be interesting in the conversation later when we discuss the Torah observing Christians. But Nick, I know you have some things to say.
Oh, just the only thing that came to mind was on that point that you just made about like Protestantism abandoning just, if you will, what they used to teach. And then Gideon, your point about like Protestants who try to rediscover their own tradition. It reminds me of in evangelicalism, right? Again, this is just where my experience is. They have the whole mantra of it's not a religion, it's a relationship, right? Which we've debunked and talked about the insanity of that. But what's so insane about evangelicalism at this point, and this is why I think a lot of young guys in particular are converting, is that because of that, evangelicals can't even go back to traditional Protestantism. Like to say, like I remember when I was growing up in evangelicalism, I was like, why can't we go back to hymns? Like, can't we? I'll tell you guys this one story one time. When I was in like senior of high school, we were at our evangelical church having this event where you could come and ask questions about the church. So I showed up wanting to ask questions about like, hey, what do we believe on like a lot of these stuff? Because we don't even have a statement of faith on our website. And no statement of faith that's ever given to us. We never had a catechism. So it was just denominations of all kinds of stuff hanging out with each other. I showed up and a person cut me off at the pass knowing that I was going to be speaking there. They grabbed the back of my shirt and they escorted me out of the room. And the reason then was this might be divisive. The whole issue with Protestantism is because you guys have abandoned the concept of tradition. And with that, just on a natural level philosophy, you have now regulated it yourself into the world of sola scriptura, answering all the questions for yourself. And that's why, again, Catholic Answers is great for that crowd. But I'm glad that we have people like Sam Shamoun coming on, especially because, again, like there's that whole wing of apologetics to the Islamic world that really needs to be discussed.
Well, the one thing I'll say about even Ruslan's co-host, him saying that, well, you know, I'm not going to follow it, but it's definitely coherent. It's like, okay, so you have this one teaching that you understand, but because you don't understand mortal sin and the ramifications of committing mortal sin and separation from God's grace because you choose it, like it really does come as a whole coherent thesis, Catholicism. And I think that is the most attractive quality of our faith, is that everything works together in harmony, you know, and it's not, you can't just pick and choose one thing here, one thing there. And it just, everything has to be a coherent thesis that it all fits together and just works.
Yeah. I think one of the big reasons the birth control thing is convincing so many people now is if you read Humanae Vitae, like it was just so prophetic of what happened. Like, could you imagine in the 1960s, right? Even the people who were like very big sexual libertines, could you imagine saying like, hey, in like 50, 60 years, they're going to be doing like drag queen story hours in like public libraries and stuff like that would shock even probably your most liberal people.
Absolutely.
Back when Humanae Vitae was released. So now you see, right, that everything that was predicted came true and even a lot more than that.
Yeah.
And so we realizing, no, you actually have to have some sort of guardrails on sexuality, or else you run just rapidly down like to crazy land real quick.
Every bit of the sexual revolution was caused by artificial birth control. Like every single thing we're seeing today that we're like, the culture is falling apart, all that, it's all comes down to the sexual revolution and the allowance of birth control to even be legal. You know, it's just, it just all falls from there. So now the all right, should we go back to it real quick? And okay, so yeah, Protestants are a primary Catholic mission field. This is what I found interesting, and then we're going to get into evolution because we got to get off this topic. But where Protestant apologetics is more focused on winning the secular world to Christ, Roman Catholic apologetics often has a different audience in mind. They're separated brethren. Targeting Protestants is explicitly encouraged, one writer argues. We have from baptism a mandate to evangelize. What happened? What I missed?
It's like explicitly like discouraged by like the.
I was like, what? No proselytism. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's what's. Oh, well, they see. The thing is, even though
all of their missions are in Catholic countries, every single one of them.
What it is that all of the online Catholics are just honestly dissidents and schismatics because they're evangelizing. That's the reason why they're just still proselytizing, man. You can't get off that drug, man. You just got to keep proselytizing.
Okay, so William Lane Craig recently commented on this trend. Many Catholic apologists seem to be more exercised and worked up about winning Protestants to Catholicism than they are with winning non-Christians to Christ. And that seems to me to be a misplaced emphasis. Okay, so the reason why this is all happening is because, well, first off, who's the guy who started with the Jack Chick tracts that he started Catholic Answers.
What's his name?
Oh, Carl Keating, is that?
Carl Keating, yeah. So like what he realized was that Protestants are actually really good, like it's a really good garden to go and harvest from, because these are people who already love Christ, right? So it's like you don't have to convince them of the initial arguments of God's existence. They're not like, they already love Jesus. You just have to show them how their theology is a little off, and how a lot of times if you just show how much Protestants disagree on, they'll go, wait a minute, by whose authority, right? Like if you could just get the idea of authority into a Protestant's head, a lot of times that will be the thing that makes them go down the rabbit hole of, wait a minute, why is the one that I'm with the right thing? And that's why I think that does happen.
Tom has a great point here. Yeah. I wish the church was as badass as Jack tried to make us see.
Jesuits infiltrating everywhere. Yeah, I mean all kinds.
Yeah, Jesuit ninjas
and the octopus surrounding the White House.
Exactly. Oh, exactly.
So, all right. Well, here's what I'll say to wrap that segment up: is you guys are winning. Keep at it. Keep going. Keep having these disagreements online. I know you think they're not having any fruit, because a lot of times people just want to win an argument, but you never know who's looking in on that conversation you're having with somebody that God will use to send that person down the rabbit hole.
I want to add maybe one point to add to that, which is, I think now, and I think we're moving in this way, we shouldn't also just be evangelizing Protestants. Like there's a lot of other false religions in the world that we need to be reaching out to as well. That's why initially when I set up my YouTube channel, my goal was to talk about like Scotism stuff, but I'm shifting more to realizing like that's really interesting and stuff, but it's sort of an interesting hobby for me. I could be using the platform for bring people to the church in the first place. I'm hoping to put out apologetics material responding to Judaism, because we don't really have good Catholic resources responding to Judaism, because we've been almost on one hand too afraid to talk about it, on the other hand, they are right in a certain sense that we tend to outsource a lot of our discussions of other religions to like Protestants. Like we expect Protestants to like go speak to the Jews, go speak to the Muslims, go speak to the atheists. Then one from the non-denominational church, we'll talk to them and be like, hey, they told you 90% of it, but they're missing one little bit at the end there, And we need to be the ones going in the first place to a lot of these people and telling them about the Catholic Church and about Christ from the very beginning.
The Catholic Church is the one who received the Great Commission, so it is our duty to convert the world, not just Protestants. So we've talked about this a lot on our channel.
And we have to remember, like there's two purposes for apologetics. One is to to bring others into the church, but the second is to strengthen those already in the church.
Yeah.
So you might argue with a Protestant or someone else on Twitter or in a YouTube comment or something, and you might not have any shot at converting them, but you might save a Catholic who's looking at their arguments and then sees your rebuttal.
Yeah, and you may hear something from that Protestant that you never heard before, and now you have to go and do research.
Yep.
And suddenly you learn something new about your faith, and you find a new argument that you can bring to the table. So I think all of it is good. I think we're causing a little bit of waves out there, and it's a good thing. So everybody stay at it. All right. So now I want to get into discussing evolution a little bit, because it's been a long time since we had that conversation on this channel. Rob and I both were cradle Catholics. We were both raised in an environment where we were taught, no, science and faith work together. So you're allowed to believe in evolution. And both of us, I don't want to speak for Rob, but I never even considered that evolution wasn't true. I just, something internally always told me, this story seems like nonsense.
I mean, I was full blown, like an evolution apologist, especially against my, at that point then, non-denom / Baptist wife, who was creation. So I had all the evolution arguments, and we got in our actual worst fights in our relationship were because of that. Were because of evolution versus creation. And now here I am 10 years later being like, yep, you were right, sweetie.
Well, what happened with me was it's very strange. So first I saw your conversation on Frad arguing with Jimmy Akin, right? And I watched that debate, and you were talking about living tissue inside in some of the dinosaur bones that they discovered and stuff like that. So that was kind of like the first fissure that happens, right? Then I watched the Graham Hancock series, Ancient Apocalypse. And he starts going to all of these ancient sites where they have very similar structures. So they have pyramids in South America. They have pyramids in Egypt. They have pyramids all over the world, right? And he's talking about this cataclysmic event that happened. And, he's trying to come up with a theory for why the pyramids look the same in South America as they do in Egypt, as they do in all these other countries. And it kind of just dawned on me, the gods are real, right? Demons are real. And the reason these structures look similar is because they're worshiping these demons, and the demons required them to build structures like this for worship of some kind. So that was the way I was seeing that whole thing happen. And one of the main things he discussed on that series was how every single ancient civilization had a creation myth. Every single civilization that has ever existed in human history had a creation myth. And it's just slowly kind of unfolded to me how we had a creation myth. Now, people take issue with that word myth, but we have the Christian creation story that God gave us. And then suddenly, once you get to the scientific era, they're presenting a new creation story. And to me, it just it was like scales falling from my eyes. This is nonsense. They are presenting a new creation story that can replace God. It's a creation story that exists that doesn't need God to be its origins. So it's just the modern creation story. So what is it because were you a young earth creationist as a Jew before you converted, or how does your whole story come about?
No, I grew up believing in evolution stuff. Among liberal Jews, they all believe in evolution. In the Orthodox Jewish world, this is a big debated issue, actually, because the Jewish calendar dates from the time of creation. So it's almost impossible to be a Jew and hold up your traditional calendar and not believe in creation. So this is a big debate going on now in the Orthodox Jewish world.
Does BC in the Jewish calendar mean before creation then?
When I initially became a Christian, this to me, it was almost initially when I came into, as I mentioned, to Eastern Orthodoxy, one of the things that sort of helped me initially is I heard the Catholics and the Orthodox, they follow tradition and they look like they believe in evolution because they follow tradition rather than just the Bible. So coming in from a very atheist background, because I really gave up religion as very early on, beyond like as a ritual thing. And so it made it easy, transitioning over from atheism to religion. All right, I can still accept evolution. And this is why I try not to push the point too much on people coming into the church, just because, like, I know this is a stumbling block. It was for me. But very quickly, upon actually reading the church fathers, I'm like, wait, all of these church fathers, they believe in like young earth creation. Like, you constantly hear the refrain of, oh, the church fathers didn't take Genesis literally. And that's just not true. Like, you can just read the church fathers. St. Augustine makes fun of the pagans for thinking the world is older than 6,000 years. And everyone loves to jump on St. Augustine. Everyone loves Origen. Origen tried to explain how all the animals could fit on Noah's Ark. So even the most allegorists of the church fathers took Genesis pretty much literally. And around the same time, I encountered an Eastern Orthodox YouTuber named Seraphim Hamilton. If people are not aware of him, excellent YouTube channel. I highly recommend him. He does videos on like biblical theology. And he is young earth, but approached in an intelligent way. What he would say is, yeah, I accept that there's a lot of people who sort of push forward like crackpot arguments against evolution that don't really deal with the real science. He says, that's all fair. He says, but do you know there are also actual scientists who are young earth? And so, for example, this is sort of the classic examples. He's sort of the most famous, is this guy, Kurt Wise. So he studied at Harvard under Stephen Jay Gould, who's one of like the leading biologists in the world at the time. And he's a young earth creationist. So if you can study at Harvard under like the leading expert in your field and still come away being a young earth creationist, that to me shows that there's not enough of the science to say, no, you cannot accept this. I'm not going to say that the science proves young earth. I'll say, all right, I think when you deal with the science, there's good reason to be agnostic about it. And say, all right, I can understand how an evolutionist would interpret the data this way, but here's why you might also interpret the data this way. And I think the point you made about creation myths is so central. Because this is a point that's often brought up. People will draw parallels between, for example, the Enuma Elish and other ancient Near Eastern creation myths and the Book of Genesis. And they'll say, all the Book of Genesis is doing is it's polemically responding to like other surrounding Near Eastern creation myths. But my question then always is, how does it respond? Because you can respond to something in many ways. Right? It doesn't merely point out issues in those stories. It gives its own story. And then we now have a new creation myth today, which is evolution. And evolution is not a modern idea. Lucretius in the ancient world is already talking about evolution. There's also, I think Empedocles, remember correctly, talks about evolution. And Aristotle is aware of this. And Aristotle responds in the Physics. And St. Thomas Aquinas comments upon Aristotle's response to Empedocles. So Thomas Aquinas was aware of evolution. He was aware of the arguments for it, not necessarily all the data we now have, but he was aware of the general idea that, all right, you have things that have all sorts of random traits, and the ones that are more well adapted will survive. And St. Thomas puts forward arguments from metaphysics against this even being possible. Lucretius's work is actually lost completely. And he had the same basic idea that, all right, in the past, there were these atoms floating around, and the atoms went in all sorts of random ways, and they collided with each other. And because they collided with each other, they made up all sorts of different animals. And that's why there's all these different monsters recorded in like Greek myths. And the ones that were more fit, they survived, and they're around today. So Lucretius's work was actually lost. Like St. Jerome and a few other church fathers are aware of it, and they respond, but it was lost, except for in one monastery. And this was actually rediscovered during the Renaissance. And there's actually a like secular historian who argues that the rediscovery of this work is what led to the modern world. Because now there was a new creation myth people could latch onto that did not require like Genesis. Creator. And this work was very influential on Machiavelli. It was influential on Thomas Hobbes. Like all the major figures of modernity are aware of this work and are very influenced by it. If you look at Hobbes, right? Hobbes inverts the Genesis story. He says, no, man starts out in a state of war. And Hobbes' idea that man starts out in a state of war rather than starting in the garden, that is the foundation of all of modern political philosophy. It's how do we move from this conflict, which is just natural to humanity, to a state in which the government is going to stop people from killing each other, rather than our view that no, man was originally in harmony with each other and with God, and it is our sin that introduced division with one another. And so we need to find a way to overcome our sins so that we can live in harmony with one another and with God again. These are two very competing visions of reality. And so while there's a whole bunch of different ways you can take it, whether you take it as capitalism, totalitarianism, communism, however you want to take it, all of them presuppose this new creation story. And so the only way we can overcome all of this is by returning to the real creation story that God revealed to Moses.
There's a reason God gave it to us, right?
Exactly.
Like, there's a very like a real reason why God gave it to us, and it's not just allegory.
Mhm.
It's the idea that because I've even heard Catholics that I like say things like the garden, like there was still animal death going on outside of the garden. Like, to me, when God says sin and death enter into the world through sin, I don't understand how evolution can make sense from that standpoint, because you're talking about millions and millions of years of death. I've heard Catholics argue that animal death is not the same as spiritual death, and that's why that can make sense.
Yeah, there is people in the tradition who do limit back to just humans, but people will often focus on maybe this or that particular issue. But the issue is you have to take the totality of it, right? So one of the things I often point out to people is, hey, every church father, they took the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 as literal historical years. Every ancient commentator, every medieval commentator, every Protestant commentator, every Jewish commentator, universally, to a man, everyone in human history, up until very recently, read those as literal years.
Yeah.
What basis do you now have in modern scholarship to say, no, I don't think those are literal years? Because usually what people will say is they'll say that the literal sense is what the author intends by it and not necessarily taking it literalistically. And that's true. But if every person ever reading it read the meaning of the text as that way, that seems to me to be the meaning of the text then. And no one's ever presented me a compelling argument otherwise. I had a whole conversation about this with a theistic evolutionist theology professor. And he said, well, what about the Sumerian kings list? The Sumerians have these long list of kings, and some of these kings are reigning for like 36,000 years and stuff. And so I asked him, what makes you think the Sumerians didn't take that literally? And he said, I never considered that.
Yeah.
So a lot of these historians, they have their talking points that they have learned, right? And that they don't then consider what the other alternatives are to these sorts of things. And so to me, once you accept as a basis that the literal sense of scripture has to be correct, and that there's no other way to read these biblical passages, that everyone has always read them, not only just the literal sense, we also take as binding the consensus of the fathers in reading scripture. Well, this is the very clear consensus of the fathers. Like, how do you get around these sorts of things?
Well, also, you get into, if you're going to start saying that the story of creation is allegory, well, that's why you ended up in your synagogue before you converted with your rabbi saying Exodus never happened, right? Because
exactly.
if the creation story doesn't happen, then maybe Abraham doesn't exist, and maybe that's just an allegory, and maybe Moses never really marched the Israelites through the desert either, and maybe the Red Sea was never parted. Like, all of it becomes out. So once you get rid of that main component, you actually start to disbelieve the rest of the story of scripture and think all of it's just allegory.
Absolutely. And what you'll often see is people say, right, Genesis 1 to 11 can be bracketed off from the rest of Genesis. And they'll say Abraham is our first real historical aspect. But Abraham doesn't first appear in Genesis 12. He appears in Genesis 11. We hear of Abraham's origins in Genesis 11 as part of a genealogy which stretches back to Noah. So you can't easily break up Noah from Abraham, because you get that genealogy connecting everything there. And then when the New Testament, right, wants to go and give the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, he just continues on back from Abraham all the way back to Adam, taking these as real generations. Now, the response you might get here is that some people will say that there can be gaps in Jewish genealogies. It's unquestionable whether or not that's true, but the reason that they'll usually say this is in the Gospel of Matthew. There's a few spots where he skips generations. Now, I think he's intentional in skipping generations. There are things that have to do with lines being cursed. But let's say that principle works, right? What we get is that we get not only the person who is their child, we get the year at which that child was born. So we get an interlocking set of genealogies stretching from Adam to Abraham. And if we then accept Abraham forward as historical, you can't get more than a few thousand years back to Adam from Abraham. And once you accept, even if you then want to say, all right, maybe we'll accept a young Adam, we'll accept an old world. Well, all the same methods that we use to date an old world are what we use to date humanity as like 100,000 years old. So there's no way you can accept geologically a young humanity without basically throwing a wrench in everything else. And then we also have the issue as well of Noah's Ark. right? And Noah's Ark is really important that it's a global flood, because turn to the New Testament of the 2 letters of St. Peter. I mean, he compares the second coming to Noah's Ark. And he says, Rach, you want to read the passage? This is such a great passage. Let me see if I can find it.
Well, while you're looking, I'll jump in and I'll fill some space. So the same scientists that are telling you the world is 1 billion years old, 5 billion years old, like they just throw these numbers out and you're supposed to just go, oh yes, 5 billion years old. It's just such an astronomical number. But those same scientists that are telling you that are the same ones that told you to get the shot. They're the same ones telling you a guy in a dress is a girl. They're the same ones telling you, like, they're the ones telling you that the world is heating up because of carbon, carbon emissions, things like that.
Cows.
The cow farts. There's clearly an agenda behind science, right? So, and even to when you get a secular guy like Graham Hancock showing that there was this worldwide cataclysmic event, and they call it the Younger Dryas. They come up with a whole bunch of different names for it. But to me, it's quite clear there was a worldwide flood, and all of humanity was wiped out at this worldwide flood. It's just, anytime you go up against their narrative, because that's what their science is, it's a narrative. It's not genuine science where there obviously is a way that science can be done and things can be worked through. But when they're talking about an entire narrative that gets set forth by their scientific thesis, you're talking about upending an entire structure that they have put in, and they don't like it. So if you start trying to say the biblical flood happened, now you're actually giving credence to the Genesis story, and they lose their mind. So go ahead, you can read that.
Yeah, I want to read this section. This is from 2 Peter 3. And this is just so relevant to our days. It's like a prophecy from St. Peter of our time, like right now. This is really clear. Because first of all, you must understand this, that scoffers will come in the last day with scoffing, following their own passions and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since our fathers fell asleep, all things have continued as they were from the beginning of creation. They deliberately ignore this fact, that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and an earth formed out of water and by means of water, through which that world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and the earth that now exist have been stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and the destruction of ungodly men. So St. Peter is telling us right there that in the last days, there's going to be people who come along and make fun of the second coming of Christ on the basis that, hey, everything just continues through natural processes. We don't need to explain how the world came to be. And he says they deliberately ignore the fact of what? The creation and the global flood. Now, if it was just a local flood, right? That's not something that they deny. Like atheists say, yeah, there was lots of local floods. I've heard plenty of atheists say, yeah, there was probably a local flood in the ancient Near East, and that's what inspired the biblical story. Like that's not denied by anyone. Right? What's denied has to be something that cannot be explained by the ordinary workings of the world.
Yeah, and even what he says about things do not change, right? Like when you understand how evolutionary philosophy works, they'll go and they'll find something and they date it by where it is in the layers of the earth, as if the earth has gone through the same process over billions of years, and you can actually calculate exactly how old this thing is because of how many layers are in there. But a freaking global flood would throw those layers completely out of whack, and there's no way you could ever calculate something's age if that event actually did happen.
Yeah. And I'll also add on that St. Peter passage as well. I'm thinking now in 1 Peter, St. Peter uses this idea of everyone on the ark was saved and everyone outside the ark wasn't saved to defend extra ecclesiam nola solus.
Yeah.
So if you, this analogy doesn't work if there was a bunch of areas that weren't flooded either.
Well, the text the text in Genesis makes no sense if it's just if it's just a local flood, because the text is very clear that it says, and all the high hills were covered 8 cubits and upward. So it gives you an exact measurement and tells you all the high hills of the earth were covered by this amount of water.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you have all the mountains covered in one local area upwards of 8 cubits, but then it just doesn't happen to spill over everywhere else?
sometimes I'll ask theistic evolutionists, so sorry, let's say it was a local flood, right? Can you explain to me how you would have written the text of Genesis if it was a global flood? Right? Because let's say if we said the entire globe was covered, they would say, oh, see, it's in a hyperbole there. There's literally no possible language the text of Genesis could have used that couldn't be explained away.
Look, the thing is, because Rob and I were talking about this earlier, like, I was kind of excited to talk about this tonight because we did do this with our audience on our show live. Like, this was several episodes. We dove into this stuff
with
we
Hugh Owens and
we interviewed Pam Acker. Like, it was like several episodes that we went through this, right? But at the time, we only had about 6,000 subscribers, and I know a lot of the people that just recently subscribed. Like, Rob and I just hit 25,000 subscribers last night. And we've gotten about 10,000 subscribers over the last 2 months, and a majority of them were through our video disputing Protestantism, right? And when you look at the other channels that watch our show now, you see guys like Trent Horn, Jimmy Aiken. So you're seeing a much different audience watching our show now. So I thought it would be good to have this conversation to just kind of maybe have out like some of the people who were raised like Rob and I, where we just assumed evolution was true, because that's kind of the Catholic apologist line is kind of just like, no, faith and reason go together. They can never contradict each other. Don't worry. We believe in evolution, without ever giving because if you understand how they present evolution, it is presented as all life comes from a single-celled organism, and it just slowly goes from there. There is no coherent Catholic way to explain that, even if you say, no, God had his hand in it. Like, their way of saying it is just, well, God just made this happen. Like, the time doesn't add up. There's not nearly enough time. There's too many miracles that would have to occur. And if you go back and you watch even a documentary on the creation of the earth from like Amazon Prime or something, you'll see the giant leaps in logic they take. Like, astronomical leaps. Like, it starts as a single cell, and then the next thing you know, there's algae on the shore, and it's like, wait a minute, what? And how does a single cell become a multi-cell? Like, how does that happen? None of these things make sense. It just, they expect you to just believe magic happened instead of just believing the actual. Like, it's more difficult for me to believe that than it is for me to believe that God said, let there be light, and just brings creation into existence in one shot. So I'm hoping that some of the newer people that are watching that kind of grew up like Rob and I are like, okay, maybe I shouldn't just trust this thing that I've been fed my entire life, because every single atheist communist civilization that ever existed in the past couple of hundred years had evolution as taught in their schools, because there's a reason for it. You can have life without God.
Plus, everything else we've been taught has been proven to be wrong anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think people are a lot more receptive to this discussion post 2020 than before 2020. Like, before 2020, I could not have a conversation with people about this. Now everyone wants to talk to me about this.
Yeah.
Like, the landscape has just completely shifted.
Well, you said that at the conference that you're doing. So, yeah, guys, June 6th through 8th, Steubenville, there's going to be a conference. What's the name of the conference, Gideon?
Yeah, if you look at, go in the link in the description. It's, here we go. A Symposium on the Theology of Creation 2025, an exploration of creation as God's temple. This is like awesome conference. We have Scott Hahn, we have John Bergsma, we have Father Thomas Crean. We're going to be having a retreat on that Sunday with Father Thomas Crean in the Dominican Rite. We also have a Byzantine Rite priest there to do Vespers the night before. It's going to be an awesome debate on whether or not Adam's sin caused the death of animals. Like, this is going to be a great discussion. As I mentioned earlier, like, this is not necessarily like the On Earth conference. Like, we want to return to an actual theological discussion on creation. And then we can get into discussions of the science and so on, Well,
that's what I'm kind of interested in. So you guys are going to discuss the theology of creation, right? Because that sounds so awesome to me. Like, I've never really gotten into a theology of creation.
Yeah, and this is because I think this is an important question, right? But this is supposed to be one little tiny question in a whole like larger system, right? And as we mentioned at the beginning, right, of this evangelicalism that's really like theologically watered down, I think the reason this issue became so heated in the Protestant world is this was their entire theology of creation. Like, it was, do you believe in evolution or not? All right, but that's for us one question in like 100 questions, you know? Like, if you look at the Summa, like half of the Prima Pars is on creation. How
exactly?
Like, it's honestly the issue of how does God even create in the first place? Like, how is that metaphysically possible? Is actually, I think, a much more difficult question to answer than this evolution one.
Yeah.
Like, there are much richer questions that we can be answering. And then my point, I'll have these discussions with theistic evolutionists. They'll come to our conferences and stuff. They're great people. I have many theologian friends that are theistic evolutionists. I'll say, all right, you guys will dive into the texts of St. Thomas really carefully to like this or that tiny little issue. But like, this is he believed this. Why are you so dismissive of this point? Because a lot of the theistic evolutionists, it's not that merely they disagree, it's that they're often very dismissive of our view. I want to say once we have these discussions,
I want to say something to Rob Rotterdam. We'd better really be sure we know our stuff, because most people are not going to accept this. If this is essential, it will be a stumbling block. Okay, so my point in this is not to convince people of young Earth creation. Even my main goal in this is to get Catholics to stop believing the new creation myth. Like, God gave us a creation story, and he gave it to us for a reason. And the atheists are trying to feed you a different creation story. There's an agenda behind theirs, and there's an agenda behind God's. Whose story do you want to follow? I'm not saying that Catholics should be arguing with scientists about this. I'm saying don't pay attention to it. Like, it should mean nothing to you, the evolution story. The only reason you should want a creation myth like that is because you want to explain the way the world works without the existence of God. And you don't need that. So there's some cool things you can learn about science, but for the most part, just take the story God gave us. He gave it to us for a reason.
And also, don't play the game of trying to debate the science with them. Like, that's always the game they want to play, right? They want to bring it back to science. So then we're debating the science with them. And what I always tell them is, I say, hey, I'm not a scientist and you're not a scientist. Why would either of us be like, have the ability to evaluate this, you know? And even if I'm discussing with a scientist, I'll say, I'm sure you know the science way, way better than I do. Like, I'm sure you could destroy me in a debate about the science of evolution. But like, I also have scientist friends who believe in young Earth creation. So I know you can be a scientist and believe in either one. So how can I, as a non-scientist, evaluate it? What I am is a theology student. And so that's the approach that I have to take, because I don't have another option.
That's a great way to go about it. Wait, Aaron Gorn, our resident Protestant who watches our show. Sorry, Rob. Our resident Protestant who watches our show is quoting the Catholic Catechism.
Yeah, but it's total Thomistic victory. Total Thomistic victory.
The Church's magisterium, as authentic interpreter of the affirmations of Scripture and tradition, teaches that death entered the world on account of man's sin. Thank you, Aaron. We will need you. Maybe we should get Aaron on trivia. Get Aaron on for Catholic trivia. See how well he knows his
question. Is he going to be on the convert team at that point? Or?
We'll have to see.
Yeah, I don't think there's a third team.
All right, so guys, if you are interested, June 6th through 8th in Steubenville, Ohio, go and check out that conference. That seems like a really good conference.
We do have a couple of questions for Gideon.
Let's get those questions through
on evolution or on creationism. So from Aaron, actually, are you aware of any partnerships between like Catholic creation ministries and Protestant creation ministries?
So from the Catholic side, I don't know like the inner workings of the Colby Center. Like, I'm friends with them and stuff, but I don't know their inner workings, so I can't comment on that at all. I will say that there is a Protestant creation scientist, a pretty well-known one that I'm friends with. He actually came to a event we did in Rome. I don't think I can name him, unfortunately, but he came to our event in Rome. We went to the Latin Mass together. We toured like all these cathedrals in Rome and in the Vatican and stuff. And I think he's very close to coming home to the Catholic Church. But it's hard if you've dedicated, like, he's an older guy. He's dedicated his life to trying to scientifically show creation, and now he wants to like walk into a church where instead of he's being invited around everywhere to give talks on this, he's instead coming into a place where his own hierarchy is going to be hostile to him. You know, and that's probably a hard step to take. And he also has family concerns and so on. But I do know, I think that there are definitely people in the Protestant creation world who are encountering this Catholic apologetics all the same. And this is, I think, actually an important reason that we need to make it clear that even if it's like not a dogmatic issue, that that's not a dogmatic issue then, right? So Catholic answers, I think, always really emphasize, no, you don't have to believe in creation, in young earth creation, so that the way they could try to bring over atheists or maybe Protestants who are theistic evolutionists. But there's a lot of Protestants who are young earth, right? There are a lot of there's a lot of Eastern Orthodox who are young earth. A lot of Jews are young earth, right? How does it feel when we go to them? Like, as an example, I mentioned I had that discussion recently with that rabbi. He's been sort of diving into watching Christian YouTube and stuff during COVID because he was stuck at home and there's not much on Jewish YouTube. And he was shocked what most Christians believe about the Bible. Because, I mean, it is like dogma in Judaism. Like Isaiah wrote all of Isaiah, that like Moses wrote the whole Pentateuch. And then he's coming in, like our own like scholars are saying, like, no, that's not true at all. Like they are scandalized by that. And so we need to make it clear, like, no, you don't have to believe any of that. Like, yeah, maybe it's not dogma. We can discuss what's dogmatic, what's not dogmatic. But like, it's clearly not, you're not a heretic if you believe in young earth. And actually you're going with the general tradition. So I think that we need to make that clear to people because this is probably a stumbling block for a lot of people. And actually, as I mentioned, I went with Eastern Orthodox before I finally came into the Catholic Church. And I was convinced of young earth when I was Eastern Orthodox. And this was a stumbling block for me. Like seeing the fact that you could be Catholic and believe in a young earth really did help me come over to the Catholic Church. And so I know for people, this is a stumbling block.
Catholic answers, you could believe in young earth creation, but you shouldn't because it's stupid and will ruin Catholicism.
Basically their company.
That's pretty much their position. We got a few more, Rob. Go ahead.
Yep. Let's see here. So I know you said you don't like to argue the science, but what do you say when someone brings up the like billions of light years argument as to the age of the universe and such?
Yes, I'll bring up sort of two answers that have been given. And there's one put out by Jason Lyle, which kind of sounds like cope, but technically works, which is that because of relativity, we cannot actually measure the one-way speed of light. So what we do is we assume that the speed of light is equal in all directions. Yep. And then we assume, all right, so if you shoot a beam of light to a mirror and then bounce it back, and then you divide that in half. And so that's what we'll assume is the speed of light. But the issue is we don't actually know that because of time dilation. If you take a clock and you bring it over to the other side so that you can measure the one-way speed of light, the way relativity works is hard to explain, will actually mess up the measurement of that clock by exactly the amount that the speed of light would have been different. And so it's actually impossible to make a measurement. So it could very well be that the speed of light is actually instantaneous coming in towards Earth and twice the length going out to the planets. That would actually be all our calculations and everything would be identical. And it would solve it. The other way, which I'm more inclined to, is this guy, Russell Humphreys. He's this Protestant, like astrophysicist or something, who's come up with this whole complex cosmology that actually factors in like certain things that lead to Big Bang Theory. And has this whole cosmology that would work where essentially, again, because of relativity, with an expanding universe during the days of creation, the clocks would be running faster towards the edge of the universe. So it might very well be that if you were standing at the edge of the universe, it would measure something like 14 billion years have passed. But what's important in scripture is the amount of time that's passed here on Earth. And so it would just be that like only a few thousand years have passed here on Earth, but it could be much more time has passed somewhere else in the universe because of relativity. And so those are sort of the two ways that I've seen to deal with it. Probably the answer, honestly, is a third way that we have not yet figured out. Like even Humphreys has gone through like 3 or 4 different models now because people keep pointing out holes in his model and then he'll go back and he'll fix it. And that's how science works, right? Yeah. Science works. You try to come up with the best way you can explain the data, then people poke holes in it, and then you go back to the drawing board. So I think we probably just haven't solved this one yet. But those are sort of the two main ones that go around. And what this shows to me, though, is that this is not unresolvable. Right? People could bring up all sorts of objections. We might have an answer, we might not. But the question is it unresolvable? Right? Because mainstream science, right? They have like millions of scientists with the grant money from like every major government in the world and like every major nonprofit and billionaire in the world working around the clock to solve this thing. We have like 2 or 3 dozen scientists. Like some of them don't even have like PhDs. They can't get funding. And then they also have like almost no funding for their research. Like we're funded by like homeschool moms and stuff who are like giving some extra money away. So like, why would you think that the creation scientists are going to have as good answers as the evolutionists? They don't have the funding and the number of people to answer things as quickly. It's amazing how much they have been able to answer. This is what gives me faith, is that really the modern creation science movement actually really starts in the 1990s. It's a great book on this by this guy, Paul Garner, called The New Creationism, where he basically says the first wave of creationism was essentially just trying to debunk evolution. Then there was the second wave that started in the 90s of, all right, if we don't agree with their model, how do we actually explain the data within our own model? Yeah. And so this movement really started in the 1990s. So given that there's been like 30 years and like 2 or 3 dozen scientists like working on this with almost no funding, it's amazing just how much they've been able to solve.
Yeah, if you guys, well, first you should donate to Rob and I. But if you don't donate to Rob and I, donate to the Colby Center. They're a good outfit. I like this one because I've heard Protestants say this. I've heard Alistair Begg say this. That God antiqued things. Right?
Kind of like how Adam would have been created as an adult, for instance. Right?
I don't know what Gideon's going to say. I don't think that's the case. I think that you're being lied to. I don't think that God tricked us to think the world was older. I think they're reading the science incorrectly and they're lying about some of their conclusions.
I think this works a little bit, but not really, because the issue is when we dig down there, we get like dinosaur bones and stuff like that. Or when we look out at the stars, we see occasionally like a star explode and stuff like that. Like, it's not like we're seeing a sort of static picture when we dig down. We're seeing a more dynamic picture when we dig down or look outwards, which suggests to me that there's something that really, like, it looks like we're seeing events that happened. However you want to explain those events, it looks like we're seeing events that happened. Because it would be one thing, right, if Adam created the world and then he walked out and he saw the Grand Canyon and there was like no fossils or anything and it was just a canyon, and then an atheist might come along and say this formed over millions of years. But all right, but God wanted to make a canyon because it's cool, you know? Versus when we actually find evidence like things are happening here. That seems to me to pose a bit more of a problem.
So wait, you're agreeing God didn't antique things?
Yeah, I don't think he antiqued things. I do think, though, what I do think is important here is that it's actually a more complicated issue, right? Because let's say God did antique things. How would that look different from now? It's actually a more difficult issue than people give credit to. Like, I think you do have to seriously think what is reasonably a first state that God would have made. Like a canyon, right? As mentioned, would have formed over millions of years ordinarily. Yeah. But like, God could God not have created a canyon just because someone would have come along and said, oh, God would be tricking us if it didn't form over millions of years?
Well, also, I think the Great Flood could have formed that canyon.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I think.
I just think I think all of these crazy Earth anomalies you see are probably products of the flood.
Yeah. And I mentioned Kurt Weiserling, sort of this whole new movement of the new creationism. Something they point out is if you have a global flood like that for 11 months, the scripture describes, things aren't just going to calm down immediately. Like they predict it would take like 1,000 or 2,000 years for the world to calm down, right? Yeah. And this is why, like, early on in scripture, they'll be like they go and hang around the Dead Sea and stuff, and it's like a nice area to hang out in. Like, versus now, if you go to the Dead Sea today, like, nothing lives there. That's why it's called the Dead Sea. Like, clearly, the geography they're describing, it seems to be different than the geography we now have, which is something interesting to take account of.
And just a slight 2,000-year period, too. It's not like it's...
Yeah. Yeah, like, there was this one guy who created a model for the Ice Age. I think his name is Michael Oward. And he found that basically you could have the Ice Age happen in 700 years.
Yeah.
And so it would be one ice age with sort of multiple comings and goings of the ice age rather than multiple distinct ice ages. And that actually perfectly fits. And not only that, he did some sort of weather models like with the global flood and actually found that because of the higher temperatures during the flood, when higher temperatures go down, the Earth tends to sort of swing around the other way then. And so actually an ice age is exactly what we would predict would happen after a global flood.
Yeah. All right.
We got a couple more.
All right, let's go through them quick because I want to get over to the other side.
So Todd is wondering what your thoughts are on the Masoretic versus Septuagint timeline.
Basically. The Septuagint timeline, as he mentioned, it makes it a bit easier to fit in the data and stuff like that. I will say I do find the Masoretic timeline like sort of cool. Like it sort of breaks up history neatly into you had like 2,000 years before Abraham, then 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ, then like 2,000 years from Christ to like around now, and like something big is like everyone knows something big is about to happen. I'm not saying it's the apocalypse or something like that, but something is going on in the world. Like the world is fundamentally changing. And it's sort of interesting in the Masoretic timeline, about every 2,000 years, like something really big happens. Like the world fundamentally changes. And I think that's sort of cool. I don't really have any evidence for it, and I agree the Septuagint timeline seems to make a bit better sense of the data.
Grover, we're not going to cover your question, but we do have Father Martin coming on in a few weeks, so he'll probably enjoy that show. We're not going to get into controversial topics tonight. We're just talking to our friend Gideon and dealing with his specialty. So, you got a couple more, Rob?
There's one, but it might be better when we on locals, just for the subject.
Okay. All right, guys. If you haven't already, please hit like and subscribe. If you guys are not subscribed to our locals,
which most are not.
Most are not. So locals is where we have most of our fun. It's where we actually talk about the things we can't really talk about over here. It's a much different style of show because we're a lot less worried about presenting like this well-produced,
Yeah,
because we do that so well.
Come over to locals, guys. You won't regret it. I promise. If you like this version of the show, come over to locals.
You can get in on a one-time show for $4, or for $5 you'll get everything for a month. So
yeah, or you get the whole year for $50, and then you don't have to think about it again. And yeah, so guys, join us over on locals. Also, we are going to be doing trivia on Tuesday, April 1st. I know that sounds like it's going to be an April Fool's joke. It sounds,
but right now it's not planned to be.
We're not planning for it to be an April Fool's joke. We're going to try and do trivia on April 1st. So we will thank you for everybody for 25,000 subs, and we'll see you on the other side. Rob, take us out.
Let me find a good outro to play here. We'll just do
usually.
this.